Hi, in this video I'll be showing you some of my best settings of using the DJI OSMO Action. As usual, there is no one perfect setting for all scenarios because it depends on the type of scenario that you're shooting the video in. Now you need to know the limitations of the camera so you can choose the best settings to ensure the best image that you're shooting with the OSMO Action. There's a rule of thumb or guidelines which I like to use when shooting with the OSMO Action. Usually I keep this in mind before shooting any scene with the OSMO Action. A higher shutter speed equals effective stabilization. Essentially, if you're in good light and your priority is stabilization, then you should use a high shutter speed. Use a high shutter speed whenever possible if you want to get that smooth, rock steady stabilization. Now, using a high shutter speed will in fact stabilize your footage effectively, but however, it will reduce a lot of motion blur, which can be less quote-unquote cinematic for your shots. In my opinion, you can add some motion blur in post-production, so I'd say use a higher shutter speed if you want to get that stable footage. It's not going to work in all scenarios, mind you. Now, what about in low light? To use the OSMO Action in low light, you also need to take care of the settings. Now, we just established that having a high shutter speed will have an effective stabilization. Now, using a low shutter speed will result in more light, which is essential because you're using a 1/2.3 inch small sensor in the OSMO Action, so you need as much light as you can in the OSMO Action. Now, as we've established earlier, that a higher shutter speed will result in more effective stabilization. Conversely, using a slower shutter speed will result in a lot more motion blur and less effective stabilization. Now, in low light scenarios, you need to prioritize. If you want to get that footage looking sharp, if you want to expose correctly in low light, you will need to use a slower shutter speed. Now, if you're using a slower shutter speed, of course, that there will be a lot more motion blur. So my suggestion is that in low light situations, you need to make sure that you're holding the OSMO Action as steady as you can to reduce the amount of motion blur that might be present. Now, avoid walking if you want to get some sharp footage from the OSMO Action, as if you're walking in low light with that shutter speed, you will get a lot of blurry artifacts in the image itself. Now, for low light situations, I also tend to keep the ISO at 200 at the max, because when you get up to 3200, the image will look too grainy to be usable in my opinion. So I tend to leave it at 200 the max. The most I will go is 400, but not more than that. Now, as long as you have some light in the scene, it should be okay. Take a look at this footage of me at the street market. You can see with all the lights, even at night time, you can see that you can still see some of the details. The fonts, you can still read the fonts. You can still make out what's going on in the image. Now, usually for time lapses, I like to use a low shutter speed. A lower shutter speed will result in a longer exposure. It will result in light streaks. If you want to use a slower shutter speed in the time-lapse settings, you might need to get yourself an ND filter to go in front of the camera. Now, using an ND filter will reduce the amount of light entering into the OSMO Action. Usually I like to use the time-lapse function at night, because at night you need to use that slower shutter speed. Now, by using that slower shutter speed, you can get really nice light streaks. If you stick it to a car, then you can make those drive lapses or hyperlapses at night. Now, for time lapses, there is no rock steady feature, so if you're moving about, you will see those wavy lines. So for example, in this footage, you can see that even though the OSMO Action is stuck on my car, you can still see the wavy light streaks because my car is bumping up and down in the OSMO Action. Now, I seldomly use the auto exposure function in the time-lapse settings because it caps out at 1/8 of a second. So you can't do those holy grail time lapses. You can't do those day to night or night to day time lapses. It's a bit of a shame. If you're driving and you're using the time-lapse function, you tend to want to keep the interval as close to your shutter speed as long as possible. Now what do I mean? If let's say you have a shutter speed of 3 seconds, you want the interval be at 4 seconds. So essentially the Osmo Action takes a picture every 4 seconds, leaving that 1 second gap in between shots. Now that allows for a smoother looking time-lapse, especially when you're driving around really fast. Now if you're taking pictures of weather, it may not matter as much. If you're taking pictures of the clouds, you can use a longer interval to showcase a longer passage of time, especially if the clouds are moving rapidly. You can get some really nice time lapses. Now for slow motion, I just keep it at 8 times slow-mo, so you'll get 240 frames per second. I try to keep the shutter speed at twice the frame rate, so if I'm shooting at 240 frames per second, I try to keep it at 1/500th of a second. Now usually in the day, 1/500th of a second is sufficient to expose correctly. Now when you're using the slow-mo function, there is also no rock steady feature. Now for hyperlapses, I tend to not use those often. Essentially the shutter speed caps out at 1/30th of a second, so it might look good during daytime, but at nighttime you're very limited with it. Now I hope that this video helps. My name is Afi. Please like and subscribe. Let me know in the comments below if any of this helps you. Check out my Osmo Action playlist. Check out my previous videos of the Osmo Action. Let me know in the comments below if you have any more questions regarding settings that I use. Maybe in the next video I'll show you how to make money using your Osmo Action. I'll see you guys later. Thank you.